Is that because there's a really clear kind of financial benefit case? You can go to a demand customer and say, we're confident that we can operate this network with a revenue associated with it, so we can go and give you an asset value for that.
Correct.
And is that sort of asset value is that the main benefit? Is it the sole benefit, or are there other things?
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Road Knight Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk.
Right, good afternoon and welcome to the Road Knight Taylor Connectology podcast. It's a special day today because it's not just a couple of connectologists. So Philip Bale and myself are joined by the ESP Utilities Group, so one of our IDNOs in the UK. So I've got Adam Miller, Chief Commercial Officer, and Nick Clark, one of the founders of ESP, and now Director of Strategic Accounts, which we think is a great job title, Nick.
Thank you very much.
It's really nice to have you both with us.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So, I mean, I think we thought that IDNOs, obviously, we do work on lots of connections where ultimately they're adopted by an IDNO, not necessarily always by the DNO. And I think there are a lot of questions often about IDNOs. So, first of all, do you want to just give us a bit of an intro to ESP and sort of how you do things?
Yeah, so ESP's got quite a lot of history in the market. So we're one of the very early entrants back in 2002. Was that right, Nick?
2000 we started.
2000.
Yeah.
There you go. My mistake. So Nick was there, so he should be telling the story.
That's quite old for an IDNO.
Back then it was an IGT. So we started as a gas transporter, and then once the market opened, then we moved quickly into electricity. And more recently, we've moved into independent water adoption as well. So we offer the full multi-utility offer for developers and industrial developments as well.
Awesome. Philip and I will start looking lost if we talk about water, so we might have to keep it grid.
Well, we try not to mix electricity as often as possible.
Definitely. Nice combination.
Awesome. And so I suppose like the first question I think is probably from your perspective and everything you've seen over the last 20 years, what types of connections tend to use IDNOs and what are the benefits? That's probably the first thing, isn't it?
So it started off primarily around residential. And I think one of the key drivers for the competition in connections was house developers and how difficult it was to get connections effectively and efficiently and at good value with good service. So the aims, if you like, of the regulator Ofgem have been largely met. They can tick the box on competition in the market now. So we think it's hard to put to nail this down exactly, but we think something like 90% of new homes are now connected via an IDNO, meaning that the direct connection to the DNO is very much the exception rather than the rule. So sometimes there are examples of where it's more appropriate, or there are some particular circumstances or particular price points which mean that the DNO is the chosen solution. Generally, for residential work, that isn't the case anymore. So in summary, competition box ticked by Ofgem. Very different, though, in industrial and commercial. So for us, we describe industrial and commercial as everything that isn't residential. So that's everything from chip shop on a parade of shops all the way up to 150 megawatt data center and everything in between. We did a piece of work, actually, with KPMG a few years ago now, 2019, I think it was. And we asked them to do a study of the industrial and commercial market for us. When they looked at it and they came back to us, they said, about 85% of I&C, industrial and commercial work, was going back to the DNO, which was a real sort of surprise. It wasn't so much a surprise to us because we were heavily into residential, but we'd seen the I&C market as an opportunity to grow the business. And so that was really exciting because if 85% is going back to the DNO, with the advantages that we have as an IDNO, we thought, well, there's some white competitive space there. We can go after that. And it's proved to be the case. So we've significantly grown the business over the last 3 or 4 years through a very clear focus on the industrial and commercial market. So it's changed quite a lot for us. Some other IDNOs have always been focused on the industrial commercial market, and some of them have been very niche. Some have focused on data centers, some of them focused on renewables and connecting solar and batteries. Our focus has been more general, but that's where we've got to today.
One of the things of reflecting on that, based on my previous role, I used to see a lot of different IDNOs apply to the DNO for the same connection. It was competition at that point, and no two IDNOs were the same. Some would apply for just wanting to hold on to the LV feeders, some would want the 11 kV transformers, some would want the entire primary and all the 33 kV feeders coming through. Do you still find that today, that every different IDNO has a very different business model in terms of what's their sweet spot, where they think they'll make the most money?
I think so. I'm not sure whether it's always about where the IDNO thinks they'll make the most money. Quite often, the IDNO will be constrained by what their client is asking for. So if their client is the end user, is the data center operator, for example, and they are highly literate in the space and they understand, then the chances are they'll be asking for a certain type of connection, connecting perhaps at 132. Compare that to some other types, so maybe an industrial estate where they're using a utilities consultant who doesn't know a lot about HV or EHV, and they'll ask a different set of questions of the IDNO, and the IDNO can only respond to that because they may not have the capacity to go and fully unpick all of the needs of that client if they're dealing with thousands of clients like we are. So we'll have to try and channel our efforts of trying to understand more deeply the needs of a client into ones where we can get the best reward.
And just from your point of view, would you prefer to try and adopt as much as possible, or do you want to try and have the DNO adopt a certain amount and then you would adopt what you need?
Oh, so there's two parts to that question. So we would always seek to adopt as much as possible that was addressable and commercially viable. So we'll always be clear with clients if something isn't commercially viable or it's not in their interests. But that's rarely the case. And I can't think of too many times in my tenure of the last 4 or 5 years when that's happened. As ESP, we don't seek to go out and win the whole market. So we're pretty selective about the sectors that work for us and where we should focus and where clients value the sort of technical competence that we bring.
In terms of sort of new connections happening at pace now, I guess there's quite a lot in the connections market which is not pure demand. So you've got kind of quite a lot of energy storage that you mentioned, generation, and then I suppose more novel types of demand. We chatted before about EVs, didn't we? So, I mean, are any of those kind of key market sectors for you?
Yes. So I think we've been really successful. We moved early on EV. So different ways you could measure it. The way that I like to measure it is that we've got about a 40% market share of public ultra rapid charging hub connections.
Yeah, okay.
So it's a very specific part of the market, but it's the piece that's rolling out and consuming the most capacity at the moment. So
those are like sort of 5 MVA type.
Well, between 1 and 5 MVA, I would say typical, but rising up to say 40 MVA for some of the motorway service areas that are now being brought forward with the rapid charging fund. But EV is quite particular, and it was a really interesting market because in the early days, very few people really knew what was going on. Most of the clients had a low level of understanding. They were all accelerating super fast. They all had a large amount of investment. Everybody needed to accelerate, but nobody quite knew what they were doing. And so it was a perfect place for a highly technically competent partner to put together a service offer, which we did, and it's worked really well. So we've held people's hands through the whole process of getting connected, bringing value and acceleration.
So EVs are obviously kind of different in the sense that you've presumably got to have a model going forwards as to how often you think people are going to use charge points and how much they're actually going to consume, but they're still ultimately demand. I'm aware that kind of a couple of other IDNOs have noticeably stepped into the generation market, with perhaps quite kind of different business models from the traditional use of system charge, sort of where you would roughly match, what a DNO might have charged a customer. Yeah. Is that something you guys are looking at or not really?
I would say we're not looking at it, but it's something that we've got to feel is going to be sort of commercially acceptable to us. And some of those competitors may have other parts of an integrated business, such as generation within the business or a supply arm to the business that might give them different reasons and advantages as to why they might want to go into those parts of the market. ESP is purely a utilities business. It doesn't have any other supply arm, etc.
So we only adopt.
I was about to say, you only adopt, you don't build. That's the key point. Yeah,
we only adopt. So adoption is we adopt, we own, we operate, and so that's quite unusual. Not not completely unused. There are a few others that are in that model, but Nick's right. The majority of others have got other parts to their business which might push them in a certain direction.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, in some ways, that's probably what you're kind of describing to me, what I think of as a classic IDNO model, that really strong base in sort of in housing and residential, and then the sort of IMC customers and the sort of newer demand-based customers, and maybe sort of, potentially storage, but not that generation space. Is that because there's a really clear kind of financial benefit case? You can go to a demand customer and say, we're confident that we can operate this network with a revenue associated with it, so we can go and give you an asset value for that.
Correct.
And is that sort of asset value is that the main benefit? Is it the sole benefit, or are there other things?
It's primarily that. So one thing to remember for IDNOs is that we all get the same revenue. It should make the market relatively even in terms of pricing, but that isn't the case. So because everyone's got a whole different set of assumptions about what they think is going to happen. They've also got different sets of risk and their attitude to risk and their investor sort of acceptance of risk. And so talked about different models. So if we looked at the battery market, for example, a few years ago, you could look at the battery market and say, right, my client is operating in this part of the market. Now, whether that was frequency response or something else, today, if you spoke to a leading battery operator, the chances are they'll be in multiple markets, and that strategy could change on a dime, and even by minute, which markets they participate in. So if you had a model where you were imagining that people were going to charge on green in the green zone and discharge in the red zone, well, you'd be completely wrong today. And so you could have lost your shirt, your investment shirt, if you'd have followed that logic. So the complexity of this and the speed of change is quite an issue. So for an IDNO, either you've got a different pricing model and you can't just have a fixed income idea of that market. So there'll be loads of innovation and different ways of solving this, but it won't be a single way.
And this feels like a good time to take a break.
I hope you're really enjoying this episode so far and are gaining a lot of very useful insight. If you're a new listener, I hope that you'll feel like you might come back. If so, make sure you hit the follow button and feel free to sign up to our newsletter, The Connectologist, at roadnighttaylor.co.uk so you don't miss out on any of the podcasts, webinars, case studies, thought pieces and explains.
I just want to pick up on something you said, though, Catherine, about is the asset value the only thing? The answer to that is it's a primary thing, but there's many other things that are important to clients and developers that an IDNO can bring. It's the flexibility around the connection. It's the ability to allow. So in the model that we have, which is asset adoption, an ICP can work under our license in the highway because you have statutory undertakers powers.
So they don't need a section 50 or something to go and apply to the council for permission.
So that gives them significant advantages. The ability where customers need it and we think it's appropriate, we can provide capacity ramping, so we can lock in the maximum import capacity, but tailor it to meet their needs as they develop. Certainly for the bigger customers, and obviously, the way we're talking is all about the big connections. But developers, as we know, for residential, are facing huge challenges now because you've got obviously the decarbonisation, the moving over to all electric heating.
Yeah.
Predominantly, that's going to be air source heat pumps for the next few years, and it's a ever changing energy landscape. So you've got PV perhaps going on some developments, you've got EV charging going in, and the developer for the first time is unsure what he's going to get, when he's going to get it, and how it's going to be delivered. Well, as an IDNO, we have quite a strong role to play in that part. And I think for developers, they need a lot more management. And I think the key words that we have been using with them for the last couple of years now is early engagement. It's absolutely critical because obviously the queues that you've got and the complexities of connection are no longer straightforward.
And they're reaching down to that domestic level, which is, I guess that's kind of headline news, really, isn't it? The fact that.
And obviously there you're focusing on the brand new developers, the new connections that are coming through that you might look at adopting. How do you feel SCR is going to impact you as a licensed network owner? Because obviously some of your developments now will be very old. They would have been designed at times when EVs, there was only the Nissan Leaf around and not very many of them. And people may be retrospectively putting heat pumps onto those networks. And I'm presuming as they are your networks, it's your responsibility to upgrade them.
Exactly that. You don't get, as I say, you don't get a free pass because you're an IDNO. You have all the same obligations, powers and responsibilities as the DNO. And you're right, some of our networks will be from 2005 because we acquired a license from an industry player at the time. So there are a few networks going back to that date. But yes, if they need that balanced against that, there will be PV going in, and some customers will be putting in retrofitting battery storage. So there's also that to take into consideration, and potential generation going back into the networks. And so it's a moving feast, but our responsibilities are exactly the same as a DNO. If there's more demand, then we will have to manage and meet that as the as the networks grow and develop and mature.
And just to jump in there again, sorry, quickly. Obviously, if you have to reinforce a network, then you'll be doing that at your own cost now in terms of as a licensed network operator.
Yep.
In terms of your revenue models, does that mean that if the PV goes in there, effectively your assumed revenues will decrease? If battery storage and if electric vehicle chargers goes in and air source heat pumps goes in, but doesn't trigger the reinforcement, then you're getting far more use of system for your assets and therefore your revenue will increase.
Yeah.
Balanced against the loss of the gas revenue. So you're on one hand, we may see a partial increase, but the increase in the revenue from the electricity or electrical heated, so go from a non-electrically heated to electrically heated, is in the order of 20 to 30% of what the gas revenue loss would be. So,
because you don't have the fixed cost associated with using it, they then just got one meter, one service coming through.
Well, the gas revenues were always greater as a margin between the IGT sort of regulated charging scheme gave you a bigger margin to play with than it did on the equivalent Duos scheme for IDNOs. It just has always been that way because you also get a meter revenue as well as a gas transporter. So
do you think that's driven the increase in ID? Because I mean, we have, it's probably worth saying, isn't it? I mean, there are 15 IDNO, 14
at least
licensed IDNOs at least today. So that market has grown, hasn't it?
Yes.
And those are electricity independent network operators. So do you think that's partly triggered by that sort of shift away from gas towards electricity? Or increased electricity consumption?
Possibly, because I think it's easier to become an IDNO now. There are people that will help you get your license. I think also the investment market has woken up to the fact that there are independents. If you go back when we became an IDNO in 2008, there were 3 of us. Investment money has seen the market can only go one way when you've got incumbent monopolies. And I think that's driven in sort of, the investment people to look at companies that want to take market share, and whether it be across the board with residential and industrial commercial, as Adam said, very specific focused I&C type customers. So I mean, I think I'm really conscious that even some of the less sort of commercially developed bodies that we would deal with, say Road Night Taylor, sometimes support people like local authorities, they would all be very aware of competition within the electricity sector. So they would often, a question that would often be asked would be, should I be looking at using an IDNO? And I suppose that's kind of where I sort of, we're always kind of quite keen to know what people's business models are, what kind of connections they like adopting, because we sort of see that flexibility, the possibility for sort of standardization, perhaps an IDNO being more reasonable about what they will accept in terms of design standards. Philip's laughing. But I think not necessarily more reasonable, but having kind of a practical, pragmatic conversation with a customer about design standards, perhaps shared substations, things which can on an individual scheme can make and break. I think I have come across a scheme which, the only way it could fly was with an IDNO because we physically couldn't accommodate a separate metered substation. And things like those benefits are huge as long as a customer kind of knows early enough to come and talk to you about them. I think you've raised a couple of really good points there. One is design standards. We have G81s just like the DNOs do, and you can tailor those G81s to be reflective of what you want to adopt as an asset owner, and to have some flexibility there. But the ICPs that are going out building those connections can build a connection in Aberdeen or Truro, and if it's us adopting, he can have the same standard. So that gives him potentially economies of scale and uniformity, and can help improve his delivery times. I think it's certainly relevant for the EV market. That helps them considerably. In terms of customers being, I think it's been quite slow to get out there in some sectors about competition being available. I think some sectors are only in the last year or two starting to pick up on that there are places to go to. And then, as Adam said, the KPMG survey said in 2019 that 85% were still going. Now, whether they knew about IDNOs or whether they didn't, they were still going back to the DNO for adoption.
I think the EV market is a really good model of that. So we've got a number of EV clients who, when they first came to market, and some of these are offshore based, and then when they've come to the UK market, they didn't understand. They went to the DNO. Some of them have got some really interesting setups with some really odd voltage transformers, and other things. And they've had enormous problems with reliability and maintenance of that equipment. So wholesale, they're now coming to us and saying, can we get you to sort these out for us? And actually we'll take them off from the DNO and return them to be an LV network with a single standard that we can provide our guaranteed standard of service to, and make sure their uptime is where they need it to be.
So that's that sort of retrospective adoption. Okay, interesting.
And does that mean that you have to pay the DNO the full regulator asset value for the assets that they adopted, or how does that work?
So typically the DNO will only have the HV cable there. So those are individual discussions with each individual setup. But what we'll look to do, so the client will own their own, distribute their own network. So essentially what the main part of this is to help the client by moving them onto a regulated network with standardized equipment that can be serviced and maintained.
So you take over their private network effectively and then turn it into a regulated asset and effectively make it, you take over more of it.
You're point of supply downstream. Yeah.
That's right. That's it.
Interesting. Yeah.
So it's really helpful for those clients, right? And they didn't know what they were doing. So they came with a similar approach they might adopt in Belgium or in Germany or in France, not understanding how we run things here, and it's quite different.
I think it's interesting, actually, that the sort of flipping the standardization on its head. I was thinking of a very similar example, but where a customer, actually what it was that they had a trusted ICP, well, they had two, but who they'd really worked with, who understood their engineering needs. And those ICPs had, accredited designs, for containerized substations, potentially in a couple of license areas and not in some others. And it was almost like, going outside, going to the north, or going to a particular DNO's area was a problem for that user, because it meant they were basically sort of having to say, well, we don't want to go and find another ICP. We want to work with these guys. And actually, an IDNO adoption in that scenario was very helpful. I think they let them kind of standardize that design. But I think conversely, we've probably seen some cases where people have thought, this is great. We always use IDNOs, or we're going to use an IDNO on this project. They haven't necessarily got you or anyone as an IDNO involved at an early stage when the connection was designed. They've applied for a POC, and actually that POC wasn't suitable because it didn't provide a point of isolation. Or I think we've even had one where the DNO had provided some contestable reinforcement, if that makes sense. Effectively something which, because it was linking 2 points on the existing distribution network, wouldn't have been adoptable. So that kind of like quite. Perhaps they're edge cases, but do you find that more and more you need to get involved earlier?
Yeah, definitely.
Universal nods.
Yes.
Yeah. So and that it almost doesn't matter whether it's like I said, a 150 megawatt data center coming off a 132 primary, or whether that's a 100 plot housing development with a straight LV connection. They're more straightforward, right? But EV has taught everybody a lesson about how early you need to get involved. And so I'll give you an example. So we've got one client for whom we're also managing the procurement of their switchgear, because they're not expert in this, and they wanted to get sort of procurement benefit of ordering scores and scores of transformers and the other equipment. So we've helped them in that, and that's partly because we've got the standardized design for them. and our ability to then make sure that each individual piece of equipment, before it leaves the assembly line, has been sort of configured for that DNO region.
Yeah.
Because there's a high risk there, right? We hear horror stories all the time of kit turning up on site and it hasn't got the right X or Y.
Yeah. To sort of relays and all sorts. I guess it's another benefit, actually. You know, you're another technical pair of hands that's helping to advise on that sort of connection solution early doors. Is there any risk associated with sort of, customers kind of get quite switched into the IDNO model? I guess so there's a few cases where either you might need to redesign a solution or there might be some cases where it just wasn't commercially viable for you to adopt. Are there any other kind of almost like kickback challenges that you're seeing as IDNOs? Is it getting harder to do things to kind of maintain that flexibility for your customers and do things like reserve capacity or, offer those, I suppose some of the things we see are things like red line boundary changes or something like that, so where you as an IDNO are able to be more flexible than the DNO. Are the DNOs pushing back on any of that?
I haven't seen it yet. I look after a few data center customers. So they're at one end of the scale. So their connections are very sort of large and expensive and timely in terms of when they expect to get them. And to be fair to the DNOs, they I think are also embracing competition a bit more now, and they're trying to be flexible as well. Because you've got to remember, in all of this, they're still making quite a bit of money from a
non-contestable
from a wholesaling perspective, if that's the best way to describe it. Effectively, the sort of they've got their point of demarcation and will be able to still earn a significant amount of revenue. So it's in their interest to make it easy. And I think DNOs have embraced the fact that competition is here to stay. So again, that early engagement with us allows us to have that early engagement with the DNO and to flush out those. And quite a lot of the staff that work at ESPRX DNO, they're sort of poacher turned gamekeeper. So it's useful to have that insight into how those industries work and to get that dialogue going if we need to look at flexibility.
Philip, I think probably the DNO you used to work for is probably one of the ones who has. I've definitely had more sensitive conversations where they have said, okay, you might have applied for this point of connection. You didn't tell us originally that you wanted to use an IDNO. Now you're saying you do. We might need to vary some of the terms of those offers, and being very transparent to say, we'll do that as long as we're very confident that you're not disadvantaging other customers, kind of being quite careful about allowing people to sort of flip-flop between delivery solutions. So I think there is definitely an awareness, isn't there, that maybe there needs to be some sort of, discretion or careful kind of consideration when people are looking at design solutions that IDNOs might be able to offer versus DNOs, and whether there's any kind of unfairness.
Do you think that the IDNO market is fair at the moment, that effectively you're on a level playing field with the DNO? Do you feel like the rules are completely equal?
We have an industry association. It's called the INA, the Independent Networks Association. So the majority...
I did not know that.
Well, this is news today.
This is excellent learning.
And 2 or 3 years ago, we came together as an industry. It was already existed, but we really invested in it. So we now have a secretariat and a CEO funded by the industry. We lead the industry lobby as well. So, and the chairperson is one of our co-directors, Vicky Spears. So she'll regularly, probably most months, be sat in front of DESNES or Ofgem, and is able to articulate and put the views of the independents across. So I think we've come a long way in the last few years about becoming, sort of growing up into our role and flexing the muscle and the benefit of the independent business. It's, as you say, it's really significant now in terms of millions of connections across the whole of the industry. It's quite significant.
I think that's amazing. Well, it's probably a great place to leave it. Yeah. Fantastic. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It's been really lovely to have you here.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks very much. And we will probably be having some more in this kind of theme, looking at competition across a few different elements of the connections business. So hopefully stay tuned for those.
Thank you for taking your precious time to listen to this episode. Now, not everyone is ready to have a connectologist in their life. For others, it's just too expensive. And as our team is so small, we do have to be very selective in what work we take on. And that's why we put so much effort into these shows. We want our society to have the equitable energy system it needs in order to decarbonise and to thrive. So we want to help to topple as many connections barriers as we possibly can, in spite of our size. So please do feel free to ping a link to this episode to anyone you know who might be interested, because it would mean so much to everyone here.